When my daughter got married, I did not tell her that I had inherited $9 million from my father. Something in my chest told me to stay quiet, and thank God I listened, because 4 days after the wedding, my new son-in-law walked into my kitchen with a lawyer sitting beside him, folder in hand, ready for me to sign my life away. He had no idea I had already seen every move he made before he made it. My name is Helen Ashby. I am 63 years old. I live in a small brick house outside Columbus, Ohio, the same house I raised my daughter in after her father left us both when Nadia was only 6. For years I worked double shifts at a diner on Route 40, then spent 22 years as a school librarian, quietly stamping due dates on the corners of books while raising a girl on my own. Nobody at that school knew what was waiting for me in a bank account 2 counties over. Nobody looked at my old sedan in the parking lot and thought twice about it. That is exactly how I wanted it kept. Settle in, because this story does not end the way you think it will. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, and tell me where you are watching from, because trust me, you do not want to miss how this one turns out. Before I go further, let me tell you a little more about who I was before any of this happened, because it matters for understanding why I made the choice I made. I grew up in a small house on the east side of Columbus, the only child of a man who worked constantly and a mother who died far too young. After she passed, my father buried himself in work the way some men do, and I learned early on how to take care of myself. I put myself through community college studying library science, worked nights at a diner to pay for it, and never once asked my father for a dime, partly out of pride and partly because I knew he would have made me feel small for needing it. When I got pregnant with Nadia at 26, unmarried and completely on my own after her father decided fatherhood was not for him, my own father barely reacted at all. He sent a card. That was the extent of his involvement for years. I raised Nadia in that same small brick house, working double shifts, clipping coupons, sitting up late some nights doing the math on whether we could afford new shoes for her before winter. Nobody would have looked at me back then and guessed that decades later I would be sitting across from a lawyer hearing the words $9 million. I tell you all of this because I need you to understand exactly how far that number was from the life I actually lived, and exactly why it frightened me as much as it excited me. My father was a man named Walter Cobb, and for most of my adult life he was little more than a name on a Christmas card. He built a small printing company in the 1960s into something much bigger, a business that eventually supplied packaging materials to half the grocery chains in the Midwest. By the time I was in my 20s, he had a house with a circular driveway and a wife who was not my mother, because my mother had passed when I was 14, and Walter had remarried within 2 years, something I never fully forgave him for. We had one terrible fight about it when I was 26, right around the time I told him I was pregnant with Nadia and had no intention of marrying the man who fathered her. He called me foolish. Called him cold. After that, we spoke maybe twice a year, always short, always polite, always distant. He sent money on Nadia's birthday every single year without fail, but he never once came to see her play softball, never came to a single school event, never asked to hold her as a baby. I told myself I did not need him. I got very good at telling myself that. Then one rainy Thursday in late February, I got a phone call from a law office downtown. My father had died in his sleep at 87 years old. No long illness, no warning. Just his heart finally giving out sometime in the night. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after that call ended, phone still in my hand, trying to figure out what I was supposed to feel about a man I had spent 30 years keeping at a careful distance. Grief came eventually, but so did something else, something heavier and harder to name. A strange, nervous curiosity about what would happen next. I had no idea that next Thursday would turn my entire world upside down. The reading of the will took place 9 days later in a quiet office with tall windows, handled by a lawyer named Robert Kessler who had managed my father's affairs for almost 20 years. I walked in expecting maybe an old watch, a box of photographs, something small and sentimental to remember him by. I did not expect Mr. Kessler to slide a folder across his desk and tell me that my father had left the entire estate to me. The house, what remained of the printing company after it was sold 3 years earlier, every investment account, all of it. Once the taxes were settled and the accounts were combined, Mr. Kessler said the number quietly, almost gently, like he was handing me something fragile. Just over $9 million. I remember the room going completely silent except for the sound of rain against the window behind him. I asked him to repeat it, not because I had not heard him the first time, but because my mind simply refused to accept it. Mr. Kessler waited patiently while I sat there trying to breathe normally, then walked me through the details slowly, page by page: the printing company sale, the investment portfolio my father had quietly built over 30 years, a life insurance policy I never knew existed, and the colonial house sitting empty on 3 acres of land. Every few minutes I found myself glancing toward the door, half expecting someone to walk in and tell me this had all been some kind of mistake, that the money actually belonged to someone else, some other daughter my father had loved more openly than he had ever managed to love me. He told me there was also a letter, sealed, written in my father's own hand, meant only for me. I did not open it there in that office. I folded it into my purse and drove home with both hands gripping the wheel like the road might tilt underneath me at any second. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I finally opened the letter. My father's handwriting was shaky by the end of his life, nothing like the confident signature I remembered from my childhood, but I could still make out every word. He wrote that he knew he had failed me in the ways that mattered most, that he had spent so many years mistaking money for love that he forgot to offer the second one at all. He wrote that he hoped I would use what he left behind more wisely than he ever used his own fortune, and that he hoped it would buy me something he never managed to buy for himself, which was peace. I sat with that letter for a long time, reading it 3 or 4 times over, feeling grief finally catch up to me in a way it had not managed to during the funeral itself. Somewhere in the middle of that quiet grief, a decision started forming in my mind, one that felt less like a choice and more like something I already knew before I had fully thought it through. I decided I would not tell a single soul. Not my sister, not my closest friend from the library, and especially not Nadia, who at that time was only 4 months away from her own wedding day. I told myself it was temporary, that I only needed some time to think clearly before this kind of money changed the way anyone looked at me or at her. I had no way of knowing yet just how right that quiet instinct would turn out to be. In the days that followed, I drove out to see the house my father had left behind, a large colonial on 3 acres that felt strangely cold and unfamiliar even though I had visited it a handful of times over the years. Walking through those empty rooms, I found myself thinking less about the money and more about all the dinners we never shared, all the phone calls that lasted 4 minutes instead of 40. I made the decision that day to sell the house rather than keep it, unable to picture myself or Nadia ever feeling at home inside those walls. The sale alone, once finalized months later, added another $600,000 to the estate, a number so large it barely felt real when Mr. Kessler read it out over the phone. I remember standing in my own small kitchen holding the receiver, looking around at the same chipped countertops and the same second-hand table I had eaten dinner at with Nadia 1,000 times, and feeling like I was living 2 completely different lives at once. Nadia grew up to be exactly the kind of woman I always hoped she would become, gentle in a way that never felt weak, hard-working without ever letting work swallow up the rest of her. She studied nursing at a state school 2 hours away, came home most holidays even when I told her not to worry about the drive, and never once complained about the years we spent stretching every paycheck thin. She got a solid job at a hospital after graduation, nothing glamorous, but steady, the kind of job that let her build a quiet, stable life for herself. She was the sort of daughter who called just to check in, who remembered small details about my week and asked about them the next time we spoke. I tell you this not to brag, though I suppose in some ways I am, but because it matters for what comes next. A young woman like that, kind and a little trusting by nature, raised by a mother who worked constantly and never had much room to teach her suspicion, was exactly the kind of person someone like Derek would know precisely how to read. Nadia had been dating a man named Derek Halloway for almost 3 years by the time my father passed away. Derek was 29, worked in what he described as marketing consulting, though I could never quite pin down exactly what that meant in practice. He was polished in a way that felt rehearsed, always perfectly dressed, always quick with a compliment about my garden or my cooking or the little things around my house. Nadia adored him completely, and I wanted so badly to be happy for her. I truly tried. But there was something about the questions Derek asked, The careful, almost lazy way he worked them into conversation that never sat easy in my stomach. Early on, long before I knew anything about the inheritance, he asked me once over coffee, almost as an afterthought, whether my father and I were close, and whether there had ever been talk in the family about money passing down someday. I laughed it off at the time and told him my father and I barely spoke more than a few times a year. He nodded slowly, sipped his coffee, and let the subject drop. But I noticed he circled back to a version of that same question about 6 weeks later, this time wrapped inside a conversation about whether Nadia and I had ever discussed retirement savings. It was such a small thing. I almost missed it entirely. When Derek proposed that spring, right around the time my father's estate was still working its way through the courts, he started dropping little comments during family dinners about building a strong financial foundation and thinking ahead the smart way. I told myself I was being an overly suspicious mother, that plenty of young men planning a wedding naturally think about money and stability. But some quiet, watchful part of me had already started paying very close attention, and once you start noticing a pattern, it becomes almost impossible to stop seeing it everywhere. There was another moment that summer I did not think much of at the time, but that came back to me later with sharp clarity. Derek had invited himself along to help me clean out a small storage unit I still kept from my years working at the library, boxes of old paperwork and tax documents I had never quite gotten around to sorting. He worked quickly and cheerfully beside me for almost an hour, chatting about wedding colors and seating charts, and then, almost without pausing for breath, he asked whether my father's estate had been fully settled yet, whether there might be old paperwork from that mixed in with everything else in the unit. I told him, honestly at the time, that everything from my father's estate was being handled separately by a lawyer downtown. He nodded and smiled and changed the subject back to seating charts within seconds, but I noticed he had used the word estate, a word I had never once used around him, a word Nadia herself rarely used. I remember standing there holding a box of old due date cards from the library, feeling a small chill move down my spine that I quickly talked myself out of. Looking back now, I can see with painful clarity how carefully Derek laid his groundwork, how deliberately he asked his questions in a way that always sounded harmless on the surface. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking the nerves of a young groom. I was wrong about that, and I would learn exactly how wrong soon enough. In those early months after the inheritance, I lived a strange kind of double life that almost nobody around me could see. I still drove my same old sedan with the dent in the back bumper. I still clipped coupons out of habit more than necessity, still shopped the sale racks at the grocery store, still packed my lunch for the volunteer shifts I kept doing at the library after retiring. But quietly, behind all of that ordinary routine, I met with a financial advisor Mr. Kessler recommended, a careful, soft-spoken man named Arthur Pines who helped me understand exactly what $9 million actually meant in practical terms, how it could be invested, protected, grown slowly instead of spent carelessly. I remember sitting in his office asking him, almost sheepishly, whether it was normal to feel more anxious with the money than I ever felt without it. He told me that was more common than people expected, that sudden wealth after a lifetime of scarcity does strange things to a person's sense of safety, because you spend so many years afraid of not having enough that you never quite learn how to be afraid of something else entirely, which is having too much and not knowing who around you can be trusted with that truth. Wedding planning that summer turned into its own kind of pressure. Derek wanted a venue out at a restored lakeside in nearly an hour outside the city, the kind of place that charged more for one Saturday evening than most families earned in 2 full months. Nadia kept apologizing to me about the cost every time we spoke, telling me they were doing their best to make it work on their own income. And every single time she said that, something in my chest tightened just a little more. I had $9 million sitting quietly in an account bearing my name, and my daughter was pulling up spreadsheets on her laptop trying to figure out how to afford a wedding cake. Eventually I quietly covered a large portion of the wedding costs myself, wiring money directly to the venue and the caterer and telling Nadia it came from savings and a small insurance payout from her grandfather. That part was not exactly a lie, just not the entire truth either. Derek, for his part, seemed extremely interested in exactly how those payments were being handled. He asked Nadia more than once who was managing the deposits, and whether her mother had come into some unexpected money recently, always phrasing it lightly, like a joke, though his eyes never looked like they were joking when he asked. Nadia brushed it off every time, telling him I had simply been saving for her big day her entire life. I let her believe that story too because it felt easier than opening a door I was not ready to walk through myself. Looking back now, I can see with painful clarity how carefully Derek laid his groundwork, how deliberately he asked his questions in a way that always sounded harmless on the surface. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking the nerves of a young groom. I was wrong about that, and I would learn exactly how wrong soon enough. The wedding day itself was, if I am honest, genuinely beautiful. Nadia looked so much like her father in that dress, though thankfully with none of his wandering eye. For a few hours that afternoon, I allowed myself to simply be a proud mother instead of a woman carrying a secret the size of a small fortune. The lakeside inn looked stunning in the September light, white lanterns strung along the water, everyone dressed up and laughing under a sky that stayed clear all evening. Derek's mother, a sharp, well-dressed woman named Carol who had a habit of complimenting people in a tone that also somehow sounded like an insult, cornered me near the dessert table at one point and said, out of nowhere, "It must be such a comfort knowing Nadia has a mother who can help them get properly started in life." I smiled and said something forgettable, but I remember exactly how closely she watched my face afterward, as though checking for some kind of reaction. During the toasts, Derek stood up with a glass of champagne and spoke at length about building a secure future and making smart financial decisions as a united family, which struck me as an odd thing to focus on during a wedding speech instead of love or partnership or laughter. A few guests chuckled politely. Nadia looked happy, a little embarrassed the way brides often do when a speech takes an unexpected turn. I clapped along with everyone else, but underneath the applause I felt that same cold, quiet unease I had carried since that coffee conversation months earlier. Something about Derek's focus on money, even here, even today, told me this was not simple excitement about starting a new chapter. This was a man who had already spent a great deal of time thinking about numbers he did not officially know existed yet. Later that evening, near the end of the reception, I found myself standing near the water with a glass of wine I had barely touched, watching the string lights reflect off the surface of the lake. Derek came and stood beside me, seemingly just to talk, and asked me, in a tone so light it almost floated past me unnoticed, whether I had ever thought about writing my own will, and whether Nadia was named on it. I told him carefully that these were not conversations I felt were appropriate for a wedding night, and he laughed a little too quickly and said he was only asking because he cared about the family being protected. I smiled and excused myself to find Nadia, but I remember my hands were not quite steady as I set my wine glass down on the nearest table. I danced with my daughter that night. I held her close and told her how proud I was of the woman she had become. Every word of that was completely true. But driving home alone afterward, I already knew something was coming, even if I could not yet put a name to exactly what. The honeymoon lasted 8 days, a trip to the Smoky Mountains that I quietly paid for as a wedding gift, again dressed up as money I claimed to have set aside years earlier. When they returned, something in the air shifted almost immediately. Derek started calling me. Not Nadia, me directly, something he had almost never done before the wedding. He would ask if I wanted to meet for lunch, or whether I needed help around the house, offering to look at my old sedan or help me sort through paperwork, tasks he had absolutely no background in and had shown zero interest in before the ceremony. At first I told myself this was simply a new son-in-law trying to build a closer relationship with his wife's mother, and I wanted very badly to believe that, because some part of me still hoped Derek could turn out to be a good partner for my daughter. But the calls kept coming, always friendly, always casual, and always eventually circling back toward some version of the same question. How was I managing financially now that I was retired? Did I have a solid system in place for my accounts? Had I ever thought about consolidating everything so it would be easier to track as I got older? He asked all of this with warmth in his voice, the way you might ask someone about their grandchildren or their garden. But I had spent over 2 decades around teenagers in a school library, and you learn very quickly how to spot someone buttering you up before they ask for something much bigger. Derek was doing exactly the same thing, only with better manners and a new wedding ring. There was one more evening before I called Gary that I think about often, a small dinner Nadia and Derek hosted at their apartment about 2 weeks after the honeymoon ended. It was meant to be simple, just the 3 of us and a pot of pasta, nothing special. But partway through the meal, Derek brought up a coworker of his whose father-in-law had recently passed, and how that coworker had been completely blindsided to discover the man had secretly held a small fortune the entire time, money that ended up tangled in a messy legal fight because nothing had been properly organized in advance. He told this story with a kind of practiced casualness, watching me carefully over the rim of his wine glass the entire time, and then said, almost as an afterthought, that he always thought it was a shame when families were not more open with each other about these kinds of things, because it only ever led to unnecessary pain later on. Nadia nodded along, completely unaware of the current running underneath her husband's words, and asked me to pass the bread. I passed the bread, smiled, and changed the subject to her job, and Derek let it go easily, almost too easily, like a man who was in no hurry at all because he already believed time was on his side. Driving home from that dinner, I gripped the steering wheel the entire way and found myself talking out loud in the empty car, asking nobody in particular whether I was imagining all of this, whether grief and stress and a life-changing inheritance had simply made me paranoid in ways I never used to be. But somewhere around the third red light, I remembered the look on his face when he mentioned the word estate back at that storage unit, and the way he had watched me over his wine glass that very night, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my chest, that I was not imagining a single thing. One Sunday afternoon Derek showed up at my door unannounced with a small bouquet of flowers, sat with me on my porch for nearly 2 hours, and steered the conversation no fewer than 3 separate times toward the importance of protecting family assets properly. I nodded along and gave him nothing solid to work with. But that night, sitting alone at my kitchen table again, the same table where I had first decided to keep my secret, I finally admitted something to myself. My son-in-law knew. I needed to understand exactly how much Derek actually knew, and how he had come to know it. So I called an old friend of mine, Gary Owens, a retired police detective I had known since we were both raising kids in the same neighborhood decades earlier. Gary had spent the last several years doing small private investigation work, mostly background checks for local businesses worried about hiring the wrong person. I told him the entire situation over coffee at a diner not far from my house, laid it all out plainly. My father, the inheritance, the questions from Derek that kept creeping in earlier and earlier in our conversations. Gary did not look surprised. He explained that probate records are public in Ohio, meaning anyone with a bit of patience and an internet connection can search county court records and find out exactly what an estate was worth and who inherited it. It took him less than 20 minutes at his own kitchen table to pull up my father's filing and confirm the number for himself, purely to show me how simple it really was. Then he asked me something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. He asked exactly when Derek had proposed to Nadia. I told him the date, and Gary pulled up the date my father's estate had become public record, cross-referenced against the local obituary listings from that February. My father died in late February. The estate became public record in mid-March. Derek proposed to Nadia during the final week of March. Gary looked at me across that table and said quietly, "Helen, I think you need to ask yourself whether this was ever really about your daughter." I did not want to believe him. I told myself it could easily be a coincidence, that plenty of young couples get engaged in springtime, that I was building an entire conspiracy out of nothing more than timing and a handful of strange questions on my porch. But some part of me, the part that had spent months quietly noticing every small detail, already knew Gary was right. I needed real proof before I said a single word to anyone. Gary offered to dig further, and I said yes before I had even fully finished the thought, because by that point I needed the truth more than I needed my own comfort. Took him nearly 3 weeks. What he uncovered was not just uncomfortable, it was almost a textbook case laid out in front of me. Derek had been engaged once before, 5 years earlier, to a woman named Patricia Vance, whose family owned a chain of successful auto dealerships across the region. That engagement ended abruptly 7 months in, right around the time Patricia's father restructured the business and moved a large portion of the family wealth into a trust that excluded future spouses entirely. There was no lawsuit, no public scandal, just a quiet, sudden breakup that a mutual acquaintance later described to Gary as Derek losing interest the moment the money situation changed shape. Gary also found a pattern in Derek's employment history. 3 different roles in 5 years at small marketing firms, each one ending shortly after he had built close personal relationships with wealthier clients, occasionally attempting to insert himself into their financial planning conversations. In one case, he had even convinced an older client to add his name to a business account before being quietly let go once the client's family noticed. None of it was criminal exactly. Nothing that would hold up cleanly in a courtroom. But all of it painted the exact same picture over and over again. A man who found opportunity in relationships and moved quickly the moment he sensed real money was nearby. Gary also handed me something else that night. A printed page from an old community newsletter in the small town where Patricia Vance had grown up, a short mention from years earlier praising Derek for organizing a charity fundraiser at the dealership before his engagement to Patricia had even been announced publicly. It was such a small, ordinary detail on its own, but seeing his name connected to that family so long before I ever knew he existed made the entire pattern feel less like a theory and more like a documented history repeating itself in front of me. Gary sat back in his chair and told me plainly that in his years of police work, he had seen this exact shape of behavior more times than he could count, people who were drawn not to a person exactly, but to the walls around a person, the money and the safety net a family could provide, moving on the moment those walls turned out to be smaller than expected. He told me the kindest thing I could do for my daughter was not to protect her from the truth, but to make sure the truth was undeniable before I ever handed it to her. I sat with that file for a long time in my kitchen that night, the same kitchen where I had raised Nadia alone after her father walked out. And I felt something harden inside my chest that had very little to do with my father's money and everything to do with my daughter's future. I was not angry yet. I was preparing. I decided not to say anything to Nadia right away, because I needed to see exactly how far Derek was willing to go, and because some small stubborn part of me still hoped I was wrong about all of it. I did not have to wait long. About 3 weeks after they returned from their honeymoon, Derek called and asked if he could stop by with something important. Just some paperwork, he said, in that same easy, casual tone he used for everything. I told him to come by Saturday morning. I spent that Friday night before his visit going over everything one final time. Gary's file spread across my kitchen table, the recording app already tested and ready on my phone, a plan forming in my mind of exactly how I wanted this conversation to unfold. I did not sleep much that night, lying awake running through every possible way Derek might try to talk his way around the truth, every excuse he might reach for, every angle he might use to make himself sound like the reasonable one in the room. I told myself over and over that I needed to stay calm no matter what happened, that the moment I raised my voice or let my anger take over, I would hand him exactly the excuse he needed to paint me as the unstable, controlling mother-in-law. By the time morning came, I had gone over it so many times in my head that I felt strangely steady, the way you feel right before delivering difficult news you have already made peace with. When Saturday arrived, he pulled into my driveway with a leather folder tucked under his arm and a man I did not recognize walking beside him, a man he introduced simply as his financial advisor, Neil. My stomach dropped the moment I saw the folder in his hand as well. Derek sat down at my kitchen table, the very same table, and slid the folder toward me with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He explained it as a family protection plan, something Neil had recommended, a document that would name him as a secondary contact on certain accounts in case anything ever happened to me suddenly, framed entirely around love and caution and taking care of an aging mother-in-law. He even brought up my father's sudden passing as an example, said it so gently, as though this entire arrangement was born purely out of concern for my well-being. Neil sat quietly at the end of the table with his own folder and a pen, waiting for a signature that would hand my son-in-law legal reach into money he was not even supposed to know existed. I looked at that folder for a long moment, then looked up at Derek and asked him calmly if he wanted to hear how I had found out about Patricia Vance. His face changed instantly, the polish cracking off him in real time. He asked what I was talking about, but his voice had already lost that smooth, easy confidence, replaced by something tight and nervous underneath it. I told him plainly, no shouting, no dramatics, just facts laid out one after another, the way I used to explain a difficult passage to a struggling student. I told him about the probate filing timeline, about the engagement that ended right as Patricia's family restructured their wealth, about the employment history Gary had pulled together, about the client account situation that had gotten him let go from his last job. I told him I knew about every question he had asked me on my own porch, every phone call about consolidating accounts, every small breadcrumb he had thought he was scattering so carefully across the past several months. For a moment nobody at that table moved. The clock above my stove ticked louder than it had any right to. Derek opened his mouth twice before any sound came out, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its earlier warmth, replaced by something sharp and defensive. He said I had no right to go digging through his past, that everyone has old relationships that ended badly, that it meant nothing at all. I told him calmly that one broken engagement means nothing. He was right about that, but a pattern spanning 5 years and 3 separate wealthy families was not nothing, it was a resume. His face went pale at the word resume, and for the first time since he had walked through my door that morning, he had absolutely nothing to say back. Neil left almost immediately after that, gathering his folder without another word, clearly wanting no further part of whatever this had become. Derek stayed a few minutes longer, shifting between anger and a kind of desperate backpedaling, telling me I was going to destroy his marriage over nothing but assumptions, that Nadia would never believe any of this coming from me because it would sound exactly like a controlling mother trying to interfere in her new life. That part actually worried me a little, because he was not entirely wrong about how it might look from the outside. A mother with a hidden fortune suddenly accusing her daughter's new husband right after refusing to sign over any control. So instead of simply telling Nadia my version of events, I decided to show her the real proof, the probate timeline, Gary's research, and something I had not mentioned to Derek yet, a recording. I had quietly started recording our conversation on my phone the moment Neil walked through my door, tucked into the pocket of my cardigan, because some instinct told me I would need more than just my own word. I called Nadia that same afternoon and asked her to come by the house alone, without Derek. Told her it was important, told her I loved her, and that this was not going to be an easy conversation for either of us. She arrived about 2 hours later looking worried, asking immediately if I was sick, if something had happened to my health. I told her no, that this was about something else entirely, something I should have told her months ago. I sat her down at that same kitchen table, made her a cup of coffee the way she had liked it since she was a teenager, and I told her everything, starting with my father's death and ending with the financial advisor who had been sitting in that exact chair only hours earlier. Nadia sat completely still while I spoke, her coffee going cold in front of her, untouched. I told her about the $9 million first, watched her face move through shock and then something closer to hurt, asking quietly why I had never told her. I explained honestly that I had been afraid of exactly what ended up happening, that money changes the way people look at you, and I had not wanted it changing the way anyone looked at her wedding either. She nodded slowly, absorbing that part, and I could see she understood it even through the sting of it. Then I moved on to Derek, and that is when her entire posture changed. I laid the probate timeline in front of her, showed her the dates side by side, my father's death, the public filing, his proposal barely 2 weeks later. I told her about Patricia Vance, about the auto dealerships and the family trust, about the employment history Gary had pulled together. I played her a short piece of the recording from that morning, just enough for her to hear Derek's own voice explaining the family protection plan to a financial advisor he had brought without ever asking me first. Nadia did not cry right away. She simply sat there very quietly for almost a full minute, staring at the folder Derek had left behind on my counter, the one I still had not signed. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than I expected. She said he had asked her twice in the last month whether I had ever mentioned changing my will. I had not known that detail. It confirmed everything Gary had already found, laid out fresh and painful from my daughter's own memory. She thanked me quietly for telling her. Then she asked for the folder, the recording and Gary's report, and said she needed to go home and talk to her husband alone that night. I did not hear from her for 2 full days, and those were 2 of the longest days I had experienced since my father's funeral. I spent that first night unable to sleep, sitting up in the living room with every light in the house turned off, replaying the look on her face when I played her that recording. I second-guessed myself more times than I could count, wondering if I had handled it wrong, if there had been a gentler way to hand her something so heavy. I called Gary once that night just to hear a calm voice tell me I had done the right thing, and he reminded me that the only alternative had been silence, and silence would have meant Derek getting exactly what he came for. On the second day I finally went out to the garden, pulling weeds I did not need to pull just to keep my hands busy, because sitting still with my own thoughts had become unbearable. When she finally called, her voice sounded exhausted but clear, the voice of someone who had already made a decision and simply needed to say it out loud to make it real. She told me the conversation with Derek had gone about as badly as I had expected. He denied everything at first, then shifted to blaming me, calling me manipulative for hiding the inheritance in the first place, trying to twist the entire situation so his own behavior looked like a reasonable reaction to my secrecy. Nadia told him plainly that hiding money from a daughter and secretly investigating a mother-in-law's net worth before proposing were not remotely the same thing, and he did not have a good answer for that. She also told me Carol, Derek's mother, had gotten involved, calling her directly to insist she was overreacting, that every family looks out for its own future, which only confirmed for Nadia that Carol had likely known exactly what her son was doing from the very beginning. By the end of that conversation, Nadia told Derek she needed space, packed a bag, and spent the night at a friend's apartment instead of going back to their place. She told me she was not making any final decisions out of anger, that she wanted a clear head first, but that something had broken between them that she did not believe could be repaired, not after seeing that folder, not after hearing his own voice on that recording explaining himself to a financial advisor like it was the most ordinary request in the world. I told her I was proud of her for handling it with a clear head instead of rage. And she said something back that has stayed with me ever since. "You protected me before I even knew I needed protecting." 3 weeks later, Nadia filed for an annulment. Her lawyer explained that given how quickly everything had unraveled, and the clear evidence of what Derek had been after even before the marriage took place, it was a far cleaner path than a long, drawn-out divorce process. Derek did not fight it much once he realized the recording in Gary's report existed as documented evidence, understanding correctly that dragging this out publicly would only make him look far worse in the end. Carol called Nadia a handful more times, trying to smooth things over on her son's behalf, but by then Nadia had stopped answering, telling me she had already said everything that needed saying. Carol tried calling me directly as well exactly once. I picked up mostly out of curiosity. She spoke quickly, telling me she thought I was overreacting to a simple financial planning conversation, that families protect each other in all kinds of ways, and that she hoped I would encourage Nadia to reconsider before she threw away a good marriage over what she called an old misunderstanding with Patricia Vance. I let her finish completely before I responded. Then I asked her, quite simply, whether she had known about Patricia Vance before that phone call. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Long enough that I already had my answer before she finally admitted, in a much smaller voice than before, that she had known. I thanked her for her honesty and told her there was nothing left to discuss, then ended the call. She never contacted either of us again after that. The annulment process itself moved faster than either Nadia or I expected. Because the marriage had lasted less than 2 months, and because the evidence Gary had compiled painted such a clear picture of intent, the judge granted it without much delay. Derek moved out of state not long afterward, according to something Carol had mentioned during that one phone call, taking a marketing position in a different city entirely. I do not know, and I have made peace with not knowing, whether he found another family to attach himself to after that. Some part of me hopes he found his own way to build something honest. A larger part of me simply hopes he never gets close enough to hurt someone the way he nearly hurt my daughter. I finally sat down properly with Nadia a few weeks after that. No folders, no recordings, just the two of us at my kitchen table on a quiet Sunday afternoon. And I told her the rest of it, the parts one had rushed past during that first difficult conversation. I told her about my father, about the years of distance between us, about the guilt I still carried for never trying harder to close that gap before he died. I told her the $9 million sat there almost like a strange, silent apology from a man who never once said sorry out loud while he was alive. I told her I wanted to set some of it aside for her properly, with a lawyer, with real paperwork done the right way, not hidden, not rushed, and absolutely not connected to anyone who had not earned her trust first. She cried a little at that, not out of sadness this time, but something closer to relief. And she told me she did not care nearly as much about the money as she cared about the fact that I had been quietly protecting her the entire time, even when she had no idea there was ever anything to protect her from. A few months after everything settled, I finally told my sister the entire story over the phone, start to finish, something I had put off for far too long simply because I did not know how to begin explaining $9 million and a near disaster in the same conversation. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, and then she said the thing I think I needed to hear most, that our own father, for all his distance and all his mistakes, had somehow managed to protect his granddaughter from the grave without ever meeting her more than a handful of times. I had not thought of it that way before, but she was right. In a strange, roundabout fashion, the very money that had kept my father and me apart for so many years became the thing that finally revealed who truly loved my daughter, and who was only ever loving the idea of what she might someday be worth. It has been almost a year now since that Saturday morning Derek walked into my kitchen with a financial advisor trailing behind him like he already owned the place. Nadia is doing well, living closer to me now. Back in school part-time studying something she had wanted to pursue for years but never had the space for while she was busy planning a wedding for a man who was really just planning an inheritance. We talk almost every day now, real conversations, not the careful surface-level ones we used to have back when I was hiding something from her without fully realizing how much that secret was quietly protecting her the entire time. Last month Nadia came by on a Sunday afternoon and helped me finally clear out that old storage unit, the same one Derek had once helped me sort through, asking his careful little questions between boxes of due date cards. We laughed about small things that afternoon, ordinary things, the kind of laughter that had been missing from our conversations for the better part of a year. Watching her carry those boxes out to her car, easy and light in a way she had not been in months, told me everything I needed to know about how far she had come, and how much lighter her life felt without a person in it who was only ever measuring what she was worth. With the help of a lawyer Gary recommended, I set up a proper trust for Nadia, structured carefully so the money would always be hers and only hers, protected no matter what relationship she entered next. I also set aside a portion for a small scholarship fund at the school library where I worked for over 2 decades, something my father never would have thought to do with his own money, and something that felt like the truest way I could honor the good parts of who he was underneath all the distance and silence between us. Nadia started seeing someone new about 2 months ago, a man named Julian who teaches middle school science and who, from what I can tell so far, has never once asked me a single question about money, my house, or my father. What he has asked me about, more than once, is what Nadia was like as a little girl, whether she was shy or loud, whether she liked to read. Small, ordinary questions that told me more about his character in 5 minutes than Derek ever told me in 3 years. I am not rushing to any conclusions, and neither is Nadia, but there is something settled and easy about the way she talks about him. Something that reminds me of the girl she used to be before all of this happened, before she learned the hard way that not everyone who says they love you actually does. Some evenings now I sit on my porch, the same porch where Derek once sat asking his careful little questions over lemonade. And I think about how close we came to a very different ending. I think about the version of this story where I told Nadia everything the moment I found out, excited and proud, wanting to share good news with my only child the way any mother naturally would. In that version, Derek gets exactly what he wanted, quietly, patiently, over years instead of months, and neither of us ever sees it coming until there is nothing left to protect. I am deeply grateful that is not the story I get to tell you tonight. When people ask what advice I would give another parent sitting on a secret like mine, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet, I tell them there is no single right answer, that every family and every situation carries its own weight. But I do tell them this much. Trust the small, uneasy feeling in your chest when something does not sit right, even when everyone around you seems perfectly happy, even when the person causing that feeling has never once raised their voice or done anything you could point to directly. That feeling is not paranoia. More often than not, it is simply the truth arriving early, long before you have the proof to back it up, patiently waiting for you to catch up to what some quiet part of you already knows. I still think about my father sometimes, about the years we lost to stubbornness and pride on both sides, and about the strange, almost unbelievable way his money ended up doing something he probably never intended, exposing a man who would have hurt his granddaughter if I had not stayed quiet long enough to see him clearly first. Some nights I take out that letter he left me and read it again, and I think I finally understand what he meant when he wrote that he hoped this money would buy me peace. It did not buy peace the way I imagined it would, not through comfort or ease, but through clarity, through the space it gave me to watch quietly and see the truth for exactly what it was before it was too late to do anything about it. I also think often about what might have happened if I had made a different choice that first night at my kitchen table. If I had told Nadia right away out of excitement, the way most people probably would have. Derek would have known everything from the very beginning, would have had months longer to plan, to adjust, to make himself seem even more perfectly innocent than he already did. Instead, my silence became the one advantage I had in a situation I did not even know I was fighting until it was almost too late. I do not say any of this to sound proud of myself. I say it because I think so many of us are taught that secrets are always wrong, that hiding anything from the people we love is a kind of betrayal. I do not believe that anymore, not universally. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is protect them from a truth they are not yet ready to defend themselves against. People sometimes ask me if I regret not telling Nadia about the inheritance before the wedding, and the honest answer is no, not for a single second. If I had told her, if I had told anyone at all, Derek would have had exactly what he wanted from the very beginning, and I never would have seen who he truly was until it was far too late to do anything about it. Staying quiet was never really about hiding money. It was about giving the truth enough room and enough time to show itself naturally, without me forcing it, without anyone having a reason to perform a kindness they did not actually feel in their heart. Thank God I did not say a word, because that silence gave me exactly what I needed: real proof, real clarity, and a daughter who is safe, single, and finally free to build a life with someone who wants her for who she truly is instead of what her mother is quietly worth. If you made it this far, you already know this story was never really about the money. It was about paying attention. If you enjoyed it, hit that like button, subscribe for more real family stories, and let me know in the comments what you would have done in my place. I will see you in the next one.